but I didn't get the message from Owen yet. Okay, we are live, Ian. Welcome everybody to another live session in the Folger Shakespeare Library's day-long series of sessions and events and activities and invitations to participate. This is all part of our virtual open house for Shakespeare's birthday. I'm Kathleen Lynch, Executive Director of the Folger Institute, and I'm here this afternoon to talk with Professor Ian Smith. Ian is a professor of English at Lafayette College and the Sell Chair in the Humanities there. Professor Smith was going to have delivered the annual Shakespeare's Birthday Lecture for us this year, and that has been postponed along with so much else, so many other massive interruptions in our daily lives and in our institutional work and our professional work. His topic was reading Shakespeare while white. We look forward to rescheduling that lecture as soon as we can. And of course, Ian, I think you know too, as well as I do, it would have been tonight. So we're missing that again freshly today, missing that opportunity. We'll reschedule as soon as we can safely. And please pay attention to all of the channels by which we promote our activities, including the website folger.edu. There is a really long tradition of the birthday lecture at the Folger. In fact, the very first one was delivered on the opening day as part of the opening ceremonies of the library in 1932. As far as I can tell, the only sustained interruption to the pattern of the annual birthday lecture was World War II. In fact, there's actually a much richer mythology about the lecture in the history of the Folger Library, because anybody who works at the Folger can tell you the story of Henry Folger having attended a lecture by Ralph Waldo Emerson when he was an undergraduate at Amherst College. He was so inspired by Emerson that he went on to read more of Emerson's essays, and his lifelong passion for Shakespeare was ignited by reading Emerson on Shakespeare. So the history of the Folger and the birthday lecture in particular, so deeply embedded in the American response to Shakespeare. In any given one of these lectures, you get a really deep dive into a scholar's work in progress, and you get a sense of the craftsmanship of scholarship too. It's one of the things we so appreciate and enjoy about the lecture. But also when you think about them as a tradition, you see waves and trends, and you see how scholarship builds over time. And sometimes it's very incrementally, and sometimes there are dramatic changes in direction. So all of that is to say, Ian, you would have been presenting us, and you will, when we get to it, be presenting us with one of those dramatic shifts in understanding and a real challenging of some assumptions, some unexamined assumptions. And today we're just going to step back from the lecture itself and have a conversation about the way you think through your research and the conceptual frame you have for it. The perspective that you're offering us is one that, especially today with this keyword of whiteness, it's a perspective that challenges an exclusive association of race with blackness. And you're inviting us, and again, challenging, even testing us, to understand whiteness as a racial concept or category. And now let me say to those of you who have joined in, as we're talking and as you have questions, please use the chat function, and we will leave time at the end. We've given ourselves about a half an hour this afternoon. We'll have time to take a few questions. But Ian, let's go back to that keyword of whiteness. Obviously, you're not starting with a superficial observation about anybody's color of skin. But what is it? How do you unpack that term of whiteness for us?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be here today to have a conversation with you, Kathleen. I'm thinking of whiteness, that it does have something to do with skin color to some degree. insofar as a culture, we tend to read bodies in particular ways and assign value and values to those bodies as a culture. And historically, we have done so. So I don't want us to lose sight of that, because I think that is important as a way of understanding what identity and identification might mean in our conversation today as well. But you're right, beyond that, there is the question of really an ideology, a way of thinking, a pervasive set of attitudes about Shakespeare that is then associated with a certain class, a certain gatekeepers who have been responsible for the creation of what we may call the Shakespeare industry, the maintenance of that industry, and indeed the continued livelihood of that industry to some degree. So I am in fact talking about whiteness in both those senses, because I think one is contingent on the other, certainly in the way we live our lives, if not in an abstract philosophical sense. So we live our lives as if the whiteness of one's body does have value, because that in fact has been a historical fact and reality. So we don't want to overlook that at all. Now, you mentioned the history of the birthday lecture. In a sense, what I am suggesting in the broadest sense is that the history of the birthday lecture might in fact stand as a kind of representative of the kind of issue that we're talking about here, which is, to what degree have we not talked about first race in Shakespeare and taken it seriously at the core of Shakespeare studies? Mm-hmm. That is to say, I still believe and I still sense when we get questions or responses from audiences when work is presented, that there is still a lingering skepticism, one might say, about this notion of race and Shakespeare. So on the one hand, part of that skepticism has been about, let us say, blackness in Shakespeare in both senses, i.e. the physical black body or bodies in history, as well as the ideology of blackness, as produced, by the way, by a white culture. That is what is in particular here. That blackness, as we have understood it, certainly in history for the most part, blackness has produced by white culture. So then what we have had to do is rethink and address that notion of what that construct of blackness is, and explore and expose it for its limits and limitations placed on real people of color in history and in society even today. So historically then, we have talked about race in Shakespeare, and historically we've had to do the kind of work which I would call the empirical work. That is to say, we've had to find the evidence, establish the field, think about, is there a Black presence in England? Was there a Black presence in England, in the early modern period? What about trans-Mediterranean trade and exchange and culture and diplomacy and economic transaction? We have to think about what is the status of Blacks in England and in Europe. Were they simply servants, and did servanthood mean something else? Did servanthood have a particular status akin to slavery as well? All those kinds of questions, one has to do the kind of work, in addition to the work of thinking about nationalism, imperialism, colonialism in the period as sort of the big sort of framing political questions that would engage questions of race. So that sort of work had to be done. So in a way, that's part of it.
Right. So you're talking, you really are talking about the movement over time and the building of a new field of studies within and around expanding Shakespeare studies, interrupting Shakespeare studies. Where do you think we've gotten now in scholarly discourse about these questions and this understanding of how race actually functioned in the early modern period?
Yeah, that is the second part of what I was about to say.
Okay.
No, thank you. So in fact, that's, let's say, phase one of the work that had to be done. Phase two, in a way now, is what then about the other half of the equation? That is to say, blackness doesn't exist on its own, as I suggested. Blackness is in fact a construct of whiteness. So then we have to now ask ourselves the question that perhaps we had not given that much attention to explicit for a long time, and ask, well, what about whiteness? what role has whiteness played in the sort of construction of blackness? What is that whiteness and construction of Shakespeare? And so there are two concepts I'd like to sort of underscore. One is that whiteness has, in the field of Shakespeare studies, has two sort of consequential effects. One is that because the practitioners in the Shakespeare industry have been predominantly white, I argue that there is a real sense in which there has been a refusal then to read race in Shakespeare, because reading race would put that identity, that racial identity, that racial ideology on the map and up for question, if you see what I'm saying. So it is not just now a matter of, well, we didn't want to think about race as in blackness. That skepticism then can be rewritten and be reintroduced as a different sort of question, which is one about protectionism. That is, as long as we don't talk about race, we don't have to speak about whiteness in Shakespeare, the whiteness and the white identity of the practitioners, and the white ideology that then one practices consciously or unconsciously. So that's one thing, which means then white invisibility, let us say, becomes something that one has protected over a long period of time in Shakespeare studies, and it prevents one from being seen. It's a strategic move then to somehow dismiss race from Shakespeare, whether it's blackness or whiteness, because it's a way to not having to account for one's role in whiteness itself. Second point.
Okay, can I pause right here? I've been asked to do a little bit of station identification, and that is to say, we are here talking with Ian Smith, a professor of English at Lafayette College, and we're talking about whiteness in Shakespeare studies and whiteness studies. So one of the charges, Ian, it has traditionally been that it's anachronistic to talk about race as we understand it in the early modern period. I don't know if this is something you were about to address, or if you're interested in addressing that charge.
Well, in fact, I think I was just addressing that charge. That's to say, I just argued that the charge of illegitimacy of the field, which is what anachronism is about, is a defensive posture, which means that one does not then have to think about race, which means one doesn't have to think about one's own race and one's own whiteness and what that has meant to the constitution of the field. It's a political strategy of avoidance. Second point, as I was going to say, whiteness now, there's something else. It prevents one from being seen, but whiteness also prevents one from seeing, which is what I call racial blind spots. That is to say, I'm arguing that because of our whiteness and because as a field, we have as a field sort of wandered away from, avoided, evaded talking about whiteness, then we have created blind spots around race in the Shakespeare text that then makes us poorer and impoverished readers of Shakespeare.
Now, so it is these blind spots that you want to unpack a little bit further today. What changes when you take the blinders off our eyes and we look at whiteness everywhere, invisible, but everywhere operative, and race more generally, everywhere operative in Shakespeare's plays? What do we see freshly and what do we see differently?
Well, it gives us, it makes us aware, as I was saying, it makes us sort of now much more aware of us. It gives us a sort of broader text to read, that there's more to understand, right? There's more to see, as I suggested, because if we've been blinded, then there's more to see and talk about. But then beyond that, it invites us to, and we can talk in more specific details about what kinds of texts we can see, but just to make a sort of broader point, it does something else for us, I think. It allows us then to be in a position to ask, to refashion or reformulate the question about why Shakespeare now? And if we are thinking about why Shakespeare now, And if indeed we're speaking from this perspective of race and whiteness, then it means that we can have a different kind of conversation about the urgency of race now. So often we've talked about the relevance of Shakespeare to the contemporary field or contemporary times. I wanted to go beyond just mere relevance, talk about the urgency. Today, as we're here speaking, what are we doing? We're speaking, in fact, in this format because there is a pandemic. And one of the things this pandemic has, I think, revealed for us and laid bare is, in fact, the continuing inequities in our culture, which are completely connected to and derived from race, right? This is what we've seen. We've read this in the various articles. We've heard this on the various journalistic responses. That is something that we've come to realize. So, for example, we now know that certainly in the last few months, we've seen that the inequities in terms of healthcare, education, for example, in terms of housing, these are all matters that have sort of bubbled up around this pandemic. And so what we have seen is if we didn't know this before, we are now in a position to not deny any longer that race is in fact so deeply woven into the fabric of American culture in ways that continue to disempower and make people's lives unhealthy, make people's lives, in fact, more vulnerable. That if we can't see that now, then when? And so in terms of Shakespeare, we have to ask ourselves, after this, can we go back to Shakespeare as normal, all right? Shakespeare as the status quo? Do we have to then consider Shakespeare if in fact we're going to use this moment and not let it sort of run over us roughshod, but use this moment to speak about what have we learned? Then if anything, we have learned. Scholars have been calling for this for years, but in this moment, what we have understood is that we're all isolated in our homes. At least that's what we're being asked to do. And many of us have tried to do that. Some of us can't because of the contingencies of our job, etc. But those who have been able to isolate, one of the things we need to understand is that how in fact we've isolated race from our conversations and isolated Shakespeare from race for a long time. We can no longer do that.
Right. Now, okay, so yes, this powerful experience that we're all having right now of isolation, of retreat into our personal space, actually makes it more difficult, maybe it presents new opportunities for us to come back out, recreate community, come back into and inhabit these different kinds of spaces, some of them once familiar, but they will be newly strange again. And the spaces, of course, that our scholarly community inhabit all the time on a daily basis is the classroom. And we encounter at the Folger Institute our scholars in their research mode, but we know that you're working hard to use the opportunities you have to bring research directly into the classroom and to work with that community to deal with these very difficult issues. Can you talk a little bit about your approach as a teacher to opening up these very difficult and painful issues in our contemporary society?
I'll be happy to. Number one, when I approach teaching race in the classroom not as something that is going to be so painful for all of us, but as something that is about opening the door so that we can all sit at the table and have a conversation that has always been long overdue. So when we do that, one of the outcomes I'm looking for is what I call racial literacy. That is to say, I imagine, when students graduate, in, let's say, in whatever their majors are, but let's say in English, it's not as if potential employers are looking for people who say, well, I can read Lawrence or Shakespeare. That's not, they're looking for the traditional things that we talk about, right? Critical reading skills, comprehension skills, etc. But one of the things I'd like to add to that list is what I call racial literacy. That is to say, in a culture that has evolved to the point where we are now, we cannot graduate students from college who are racially illiterate. The classroom then has to become a space where we can use Shakespeare to open up conversations about history, about reading texts, about understanding the dynamics of race. Race, as I would argue, is not just a noun. Race is a verb. That's to say, race is about a dynamic relationship among and between people. It's an active thing. How do we get students to understand what that is and to engage that in an active way and to take that forward into their professional and personal lives? That's what I want to do in the classroom. And that to me is an important consequence of reading race in Shakespeare. It can't be just about I read literature. It must be about what skills have I acquired in the process of reading literature.
Yeah. That's a wonderful concept for all of us to be developing, not just in the classroom, but in our daily lives. Now, one of your articles that I was hoping you would address a little bit is one that I found so affecting, and that's the article on, or the essay on We Are Othello in a special issue of Shakespeare Quarterly 2016, I think it was, that grew out of a conversation in a Shakespeare Association of America seminar. And this was, as an issue, one of the points where I saw the profession gathering strength, this new field of studies emerging strongly and insistently, interrupting business as usual in Shakespeare Studies. But your essay gave me, this is just one example of my feeling that I was achieving a moment of enhanced racial literacy through an example that you brought to mind. And that was Othello, like Hamlet, at the end of the play, asks for someone to speak of him as he was. He asks, that is, for someone to bear witness to his life and his experience. And of course, Hamlet has his trusty friend Horatio right there by his side, who is going to do that job. And those of us who are reading, who have inherited that same tradition and culture, are going to do that job. We have been doing that job for Hamlet. But you're calling attention to the fact that Othello does not have that job. It does not have that friend standing by to tell his story. Was, as I said, just this moment of insight for me of not having recognized that parallel situation.
Thank you for saying that. And this brings us back again to the idea of isolation, right? Even in that moment of death, where someone like a Hamlet has a friend and he's not alone, and he gets all the trappings of a princely and military funeral at the end, seemingly totally unearned, by the way. So white privilege, if you ask me, right? So,
didn't the whole play make a point that he was not a military man of action?
He gets this wonderful military funeral. So that's privilege. And on the other hand, we have Othello, who doesn't have that. And you're quite right. One of the points of that essay was to then say, we now are challenged as readers, as scholars, as students, to think, where will we stand with Othello? And where will we stand in that sense of that history of racial isolation? Do we simply continue that, or do we engage it in a way to dismantle that as best we can? And so let me give you then quickly, since you gave me that example, let me give you another example from that play then today, as sort of a semi-newish one. Early in the play, Othello, we hear, is at the Sagittarii. Interesting, right? Because we hear he's at this inn. And so the question is, what is that inn about? Is this a Black inn? Is it a place relegated for Black people only? We don't know. But in a way, we do know this, that the Sagittary, of course, with the sign of the centaur, is very much connected to Othello, because we've heard in the first scene of the play all these metaphors about him being half man and half beast. So the place he's at indeed becomes a racially marked place. So it is a kind of Black space as the play begins. So he's marked. So this goes back to your earlier point about what is Blackness and what is race. Is it just an ideology? Well, it's both here again. It's a marked space for him. It refers to his marked body, but it also refers to the marked ideology, sort of exclusive space that identifies him in this very material way. By contrast, we have Iago. What do we hear about Iago? He speaks very clearly about his body being a tool, a device that he can use, he says, to mask his genuine feelings about Othello. We hear that early in the play, right? He says, if I should ever speak my truth, then, call me foolish, I wear my heart on my sleeve for the birds to peck on. And so what we have here is somebody who can use his skin, i.e. his whiteness, as a mask and to manipulate and to create pockets of power for himself. And on the other hand, here's Othello, who comes into the play the first time we see him, and he's already marked and grafted in some way and stamped in place. These are two very different approaches. One has the flexibility, the mobility of using his whiteness in any way he can and he wishes. The other one is already stamped for life.
And of course, Iago refuses to explain himself at the end. So his opportunities include that privilege of not explaining.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I did say that we would leave some time for questions. Do we have some coming in? I know that our colleague Owen was going to give us some questions. But I know we need, let's see. I might need to go to email to find those. Okay, here are some questions coming in. Wait a minute. No, actually, Owen, I'm just going to ask you to unmask yourself and ask us some questions.
Okay, here I am.
Thank you.
Let's see. So Victoria from Facebook asks if we could get some specific examples of a way to look at race in Shakespearean texts.
Sure. Several. Well, let's start with the sonnets, for example. Sonnet 1, line 1, from fairest creatures we desire increase. What does that mean? Is it about just beauty? No, it's about whiteness. And so we have a set of sonnets that begins by celebrating this idea that we want whiteness as the most desirable thing, and we want more of it. If we read the sonnets, at least the sort of young man sonnets in that way, then we have a very different look, I think, and understanding of how we can read those sonnets. Because then suddenly what happens is, not only do we have to then understand what whiteness is and think that through, that it means that the Shakespeare persona is then constructed as Black in that configuration. And so we have, for example, in Sonnet 111, that persona saying, basically, describes it like the dyer's hand. What does the dyer's hand look like? Well, the dyer's hand looks like a hand that is stained dark. That's a white body or a fair-skinned body that is darkened in some way. What is that? That is also the way, by the way, that white actors performed Black roles on the early modern stage. So it's not that surprising that Shakespeare would use such a metaphor to evoke the Shakespeare persona as a Black figure who then has to navigate the world of whiteness in the sonnets. Margrethe de Grazia talked about the scandal of the sonnets being Blackness in the Dark Lady sonnets. Well, I can offer today the scandal of the sonnets being whiteness in the young man sonnets. That's what we need to talk about as well. That's one quick example. I hope that works.
Yeah.
Another question from Kurt on YouTube. What differences are there in the way you teach race in Shakespeare to students depending on the racial makeup of your class? Do different points resonate differently based on audience in your experience?
I think that's true. I think that that could be true to some degree. But the other question is largely this. That is to say, we're all so socialized to read Shakespeare as a white object that I think most students come in with that hurdle to cross anyway. So when I teach my Shakespeare class in the last few years, I've called it Black Shakespeare, to signal, of course, that Shakespeare has been traditionally read as white Shakespeare. So right from the beginning, we are thinking, well, what does Black Shakespeare mean? And so then we go through that process. So it may be that the sort of demographics of the class might affect certain students' experiences and one's facility, let us say, with the subject in some degree. But I do think that we're so socialized to read in that way. And that's important, by the way, because what I'm getting at is this, that we are all taught to read historically in this country as white readers, which is partly what I'll be talking about in my fall lecture or next spring, whenever it is, lecture, right? That is to say, Toni Morrison's sort of wonderful phrase in Playing in the Dark, when she says, as readers of American fiction, we're virtually all positioned as white. That's that point, which I think is so critical to understanding how we teach in the classroom. And I feel like Shakespeare, we're all positioned as white. So the sort of demographics that question suggests may be true, but there's something much more ideologically important. Our white positioning, I think, is what we have to really navigate in the classroom with students.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe one more, Owen?
Certainly, there are two questions that involve casting and race. And one question was from Meredith. Can you talk about casting live performances? Is it important or helpful for characters to be racially accurate? And another similar question was along those lines. How would casting and interpretation of that casting need to be changed in order to make race visible?
Well, for the first question, I'd say it depends. I mean, one doesn't want to be prescriptive. I think that there are any number of productions that might want to think of how one casts actors, whether it's just be a sort of what we call sort of race blind casting. That is, you could do that. Or more relevant to the second question, perhaps, a conceptual casting, whereas one does want to, in fact, have, let us say, a Black actor in a role to bring up particular issues of race. So it depends on what one wants to, what I think the director and the actors of the company have in mind. I don't think one can be prescriptive. One would want to see a variety of different kinds of production, but it can be done.
Okay, so we have been around the world. From the classroom to the library, the reading room at the Folger, to the stage with our last questions, and I really appreciate this solid reintroduction to Shakespeare Studies that you've given us, Ian, and this really challenging reintroduction to Shakespeare Studies. And these may be issues that some of us are not particularly comfortable. Yeah, I mean, clearly they are issues that could have been addressed, as you said earlier, at any point along the way. It is now our responsibility to make sure that they are addressed and that they are addressed meaningfully, and that and in addressing these questions, we activate and live up to the values that we have, certainly as an institution at the Folger, as the Academy, as a multicultural society. So thank you. Out of this moment of isolation and challenge and its own set of difficulties, thank you for walking us through some really provocative things that you're leaving us to think about.
Thank you, Kathleen. It was my pleasure to be here.
Yes, we really appreciate your helping us create this opportunity. As I've said before, we will be announcing the rescheduled birthday lecture when we understand when we'll be able to return to that. In the meantime, those of you who are with us, if you want to hear more from Ian Smith, there is a Shakespeare Unlimited episode of the podcast on Othello and Blackface with Ian Smith and Ayanna Thompson. If you want to learn more about the whole tradition of birthday lectures at the Folger, they're all listed on Folgerpedia at folger.edu. And there are audio recordings of a number of them in the last dozen years or more. Finally, for those of you who are with us here, if you're in a position to do so, we hope you'll consider making a gift to the Folger. Ours is an institution founded on philanthropy, and your philanthropy helps us continue to support groundbreaking research like this that we've been presenting today, and to bring it to wider, more capacious, more inclusive audiences. So again, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Owen Williams, for being our tech support and helping us shape these conversations all along. So take care, everybody.
Thank you.